Good evening to all our friends on the East Coast. Good afternoon to all our friends on the West. And good in-between time to all our friends in the in-between spaces, which so often these days, many of us find ourselves anyway. So welcome, everybody, to the Social Justice Power Hour hosted here at the Bayard-Rustin Center for Social Justice. And I am indeed the chief activist of the center, Robert C. the Schreiber, and I am, as always, thrilled and honored to have you all with us. Our community is what makes us stronger. So thank you for sharing communion with us tonight. We have a wonderful guest with us, the author of When Brooklyn Was Queer, Hugh Ryan. He is a great queer historian and archivist, and he has uncovered wonderful bits of story and characters and important history that has really so empowered our community and so made us stronger for knowing where we've come from, how we've traveled together and apart, and how we can look forward to the future. And I think all of that is so intertwined and such a strong mission of our center. So we're thrilled at the relationship we have with Hugh Ryan, and we'll bring him on in a few minutes. But first, I want to talk about a couple of things. One, I wanted to thank the incredible D. Smith for being with us last night. If you didn't get to see the show, I strongly suggest you dial it up sometime over the weekend. She is an incredible musician and producer, worked with the likes of Billy Porter and Timberland and Mark Ronson and Lil Wayne. And when she came out as transgender, she lost so much, but in that journey gained so much more. And it was really a wonderful, wonderful honor to have that strong conversation, that meaningful encounter with her last night. And we thank her for her time, energy, and spirit. And coming up on the show, we have some amazing, amazing stuff. So I just want to quickly get to that for everybody. Our good friend, Amazon Latte, is going to be back with us. Wonderful transgender athlete with Athlete Ally and with Stonewall UK. She'll be talking about being Asian American in the LGBTQI community and how difficult and how rewarding that is at the same time. We have, this is wonderful, Michelle Elizabeth Brown is going to come to us, and she's going to curate a really incredible evening of raising up Black, Indigenous, people of color, queer voices. That's going to be next Friday, the 31st, the last day of the month. We're thrilled that Michelle Elizabeth Brown is going to curate that special evening for us, and you want to tune in for that, especially at this moment, so important. We have our Lieutenant Governor, Sheila Oliver, joining us. She is one of four, by the way, only one of four Black lieutenant governors in the entire nation. And we're thrilled and honored she's going to join us and talk about affairs of the state and also her personal journey and her public service, which is just phenomenal. So join us for that. We have Amanda Jetty Knox is going to join us. Incredible story. Her child came out as transgender, and then a few weeks later, her spouse also transitioned, and they've stayed together as a family, loving, respecting, and journeying together. And I can't wait to talk about that story with her. We have Anoa Changa coming on. She is an electoral justice reporter with Our Prism, and I can't think of a better time to be discussing those issues with Anoa, and I'm looking forward to that very, very much. And we have Alicia Day, a drag queen from Newark, New Jersey, who we're thrilled. Her performances are so strong and so wonderful. And she joined us for Virtual Pride and just knocked us off our kinky boots. So we're thrilled that she's going to join us again for a full hour drag show conversation and sharing of time. And last but not least, folks, if you haven't heard yet, tomorrow night, it's the Mike Hotpence Variety Hour. This is the first type of thing that we're doing in this vein, and no one better than our good friend Mike Hotpence to put it together. We're going to have an old-timey variety hour a la Carol Burnett. We're going to have extraordinary guest stars. Chris Murphy, the comedian, is going to be with us, and Jill Sobiel is going to be with us. We just found out. We're thrilled about this. Jill Sobiel, who you may remember from I Kissed a Girl, and don't ever call her a one-hit wonder. As she says herself, she is a two-hit wonder. So join us tomorrow night. It's going to be an incredible, fun, wonderful experience. and full of online frivolity and virtual fraudage. So join us for that, my friends, tomorrow night. Thrilled about that. But most of all, thrilled about our friend Hugh Ryan being back with us tonight. Hugh came out to the center just a little over a year ago to celebrate July as our next month of Pride. And his reading was so strong, and the conversation was so empowering, and our community was so thankful for it. When we started the Power Hour, he was literally one of the first people I went to and asked. And he came on the show a couple of months back, and it was such a wonderful, wonderful time together. I begged him to come back, and he was so wonderful in honoring that request. And I want you to know this book is not just about history, and it's not dry at all. It's a really wonderful read. It works on the beach as well. You can read it anywhere and everywhere. And it's just a really enjoyable, but really empowering book to know, again, our history and how it brings us together in the present and how it prepares us for the future. So without further ado, please welcome a good friend to the center, and I dare say a good friend of mine, Hugh Ryan, everybody, author of When Brooklyn Was Queer.
Hey, Robert, how's it going?
Wonderfully, wonderfully that I have you with me, my friend. How are you?
Good, good. Except I loved seeing all those photos that you were showing, but it made me miss things like the beach and pants with actual waistbands. Things that I haven't seen in months and months and months. I was like, remember when I used to wear a tie? Uh, the
Yeah.
before times.
And now we get dressed up when we have our Zooms, right? We have to make sure that at least our top right here, like right here, yeah.
I assume the sales of pants have been like through the floor over the last few months.
Yeah, but the sales of sweatpants and loungewear, right?
Very true.
Yeah.
Uh,
So,
it's funny though, talking about this, I was thinking at the beginning of June about how, oh God, 50 last year was the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, and it felt like everywhere I went, everything was pride. It was rainbow everything. And I was a little bit like, oh gosh, I wonder what this Pride this year will feel like. Will we feel this? Not only do we have the 50th to not the 50th, but then non-pandemic to pandemic life. Is it going to feel like Pride? And at first, I was worried that it wasn't going to. That I was going to be sort of separated from everything else. And then I have to admit that in many ways, this last Pride ended up feeling more like Pride than the 50th anniversary of Stonewall ever did, because so much of it was about being in the streets, being a movement, organizing on behalf of our rights and on behalf of each other, listening to the Black Lives Matter movement leaders, going to the Black Trans Lives Matter event at the Brooklyn Museum. And it really just turned into this totally different thing, this thing that I was never expecting from this month or this last month. And that actually was part of what inspired what I wanted to talk about with you today, which is I was thinking about what it was about this year that was so exciting and so energizing. And truly the only thing that has given me energy this year has been the movement for Black Lives Matter and all the other movements that we are seeing coming together to oppose this kind of moment of American fascism, whether that's Chase Strangio and Amy Stevens at the Supreme Court, or whether it's everyone in the streets in Portland, New York City, Atlanta, LA, around the world. That's where I've been feeling this real intense excitement and energy. And so when I was thinking about today, what we could talk about, having been here before and loving the audience here and knowing that y'all know so much and are already so acquainted with much of our queer history, I wanted to do something, that went a little bit deeper than a 101. And so I wanted to actually talk about a part of my book that didn't get a lot of discussion when I was doing it. It was something that actually surprised me, which was how much of the history of what we think of as like modern LGBT life and identity is connected to the history of white supremacy, and also how unexpectedly white Brooklyn's own history was. All of this was just not something that I grew up knowing or even learned in college when I studied LGBT history. And so it was really shocking to me to read all of this. And although it wends its way through the book, this is the new paperback, by the way. Where's the camera? There we go. Showing it off, showing it off. And although this thread wends its way through the book, it's not one that has really been brought out. And I actually got the chance last year, right around this time, to write an article for the Washington Post. And they invited me to kind of talk about how something from history has affected life today. And so that's what I decided. I would focus on the roots of white supremacy and modern LGBT identity. So if it's all the same to you, I was going to read this little article from the Washington Post, and I thought maybe we could discuss it. And then if we have some time, return to the book and talk about the deeper roots of what I'm mentioning here a little bit in this article.
I
Sound
love
good?
that. Sounds. I'm inspired by this. I think this is wonderful. The more that we can find the intersectionality in our struggles and move forward together. And again, when I say it, maybe too often, it bears repeating ad infinitum. We have to look to our history to appreciate our present, but also to be able to move forward to our future. There's no way that we succeed, any community succeeds, without knowing what the history was that came before.
Absolutely.
And I feel like you're doing such important work. And I'm so thrilled that we can amplify it in any way. So I will give the stage to you. I'm going to disappear, and I'll let you read the article. I'll come back. We'll talk for a little bit about it, but we're definitely going to get to the book because the book is so powerful. And I do want to let everyone know that the book is available. We have a Power Hour book list on bookshop.org, which is wonderful because they give back a percentage to independent bookstores and the authors themselves. So as you are being so entertained and so incredibly impressed by Hugh and you want to buy the book, go buy the book. And as I say, sometimes when I really appreciate a book, not all the time, but sometimes, buy one for yourself, buy one for a friend, buy one for an enemy who'll become a friend. Make sure that your local library has it. Call your local library and you say, hey, do you have When Brooklyn is Queer? And if they say no, then you say, I request that you buy a copy. And they will. And then buy a copy for your local school because it's important for our students to hear this and read this too.
And I will say, my first job ever as a young person, my first official job was in a library. I got all of my books from the library, which I lived across the street from. It's the first place I ever came across gay books. And so more than anything else, I would love it if everyone bought a copy of this book, but more than anything else, if you can get it into your libraries, because I know there are still kids like I was at 13, a shadow in the library stacks looking for anything LGBT. So if you can talk to your library, if you feel comfortable doing that, please do.
And you can do it online too. Almost every library has a system where you can do it right online. You just have to know your library card number. You put it in and you request the book. And I've done that many, many times. And what Hugh's saying is really true. Think about all those kids and all those adults too. Don't forget that the spectrum's also age. And there are folks out there that are identifying earlier and later because we're in a very special moment in our history. So let those folks find those books and find those things that can inspire them and empower them. And we appreciate it. So without further ado, this article is wonderful. I can't wait for you all to read it. And by the way, also, you did an audio book version too, right?
Yep. Yeah, I recorded my own audio.
And I'm so glad about that. When you hear Hugh read, if you haven't heard it yet, I know some people in our community have, but we have a lot of new folks watching tonight. You can see that. So when you hear Hugh read, not only will you want to get the copy to read yourself, but you want to get it on audio as well. And I see Michael is in the comment section saying, joining late, what book? So there's the book, Michael. Ask and ye shall receive. When Brooklyn Was Queer by our guest tonight, Hugh Ryan. And now we are going to give the stage over to Hugh entirely. Hugh's going to read an article that he wrote for the Washington Post. So thank you, my friend. I'll see you in a few minutes.
Awesome. Thank you, Robert. The article is called How Eugenics Gave Rise to Modern Homophobia, and it's in last year's Washington Post. If there's anyone who's actually able to find the link and can drop it in the chat, that would be great, just in case I get disconnected or anyone needs to read along with me. But hopefully you'll be able to hear the whole thing. 50 years ago this June, patrons at the Stonewall Inn in New York resisted routine homophobic police harassment, sparking days of unrest and street rebellion, and giving a public face to the emerging forces of gay liberation. Surprisingly, however, the homophobia that sparked that uprising did not have deep roots in American history. Although omnipresent in America by the Stonewall era, homophobia was only around the 1930s that homophobia started to emerge as a cogent cultural force, an explicit widespread teaching that the world was divided into good heterosexuals and evil homosexuals, with perhaps a nasty nebulous cloud formation called bisexuality located somewhere in between. As we celebrate this important milestone in the fight against homophobia, it's worth taking a moment to explore its roots. Anti-gay sentiments are usually traced to misogyny, fear of gender transgression, toxic masculinity, or hidebound religious teachings. But one important factor regularly goes unacknowledged, and curiously so considering how often it comes up these days in other contexts: white supremacy. In the early 20th century, leading white American intellectuals embraced the pseudoscience of eugenics, which held that human beings were the sum of inherited traits that could be read by looking at a person's body. The fullness of your lips, for instance, might indicate how decisive you were, or the swelling of breast tissue on a man, a condition called gynecomastia, might be a telltale sign of criminality. Eugenicists believed that these moral and physical traits were inseparable, and that children inherited them in direct and simplistic ways, like eye color. Therefore, the answer to all of society's ills lay in controlling human reproduction, in breeding our way to a brighter future. Eugenics was largely a response to the expanded political, social, and geographical integration of Black people in America, and those who practiced it were interested in protesting and perfecting, quote unquote, the white race. These were men like R.W. Shufelt, a noted doctor with the US Army and a prolific author of eugenic treatises. I want to pause here before I go any further. I'm going to be reading from some work of Shufelt and some other people, and it engages in a lot of language and thinking that is not at all how we think or speak today. It's very much of its period, 19 teens, 1920s, 1930s. So there are going to be some words that you may not be comfortable with. There may be some ideas that are really offensive, racist, and homophobic. So I just want to warn people, if you need to take a moment, now is the moment. Anyway. In his 1915 book, America's Greatest Problem, The Negro, Shufelt argued that Black women sought out white men because of their superior genes. Quote, "It is the aim and highest ambition of the Negress to have children by white men," he wrote, "for the reason that such children, by the superior intelligence coming from their white fathers, will command better positions when they grow up than the pure Blacks, and in so doing will powerfully further the interests, political and otherwise, of the African population in this country." This was a follow-up to Schufelt's 1907 book, The Negro, A Menace to American Civilization, in which he wrote that a Black man is, quote, "ready at any and all times to do his share in debasing the blood of the white race in America." Oh God, he's a horrible piece of work. And in the question and answer period, if people want, we can talk more about Schufelt's issues. Anyway, to protect whiteness, eugenicists like Shufelt fought for bans on interracial marriage, tighter medical control over marriage licenses, increased power for the state to sterilize imprisoned people, and increased regulations on prostitution, which they saw as a zone for possible race mixing. At the same time Shufelt was writing about race, however, he was also researching a seemingly unrelated topic: the defining of queerness, which he variously referred to as passive pederasty, inversion, perversion, and homosexuality. Primarily, Shufelt studied men who had been arrested for soliciting other men, as well as people who we would today call transgender women, who were often arrested under the charge of, quote, masquerading in women's clothes. As a eugenicist, Shufelt did not believe that someone's sexual nature could be changed, because he believed it was hardwired into the body, a more sinister ancestor to our modern idea of being born this way. But he did believe that we could prevent queer people in much the same way we could prevent racial miscegenation, by closely policing heterosexuality. As he wrote in a 1905 paper entitled The Medico-Legal Consideration of Perverts and Inverts, he believed that America, quote, "will continue to breed millions of sexual perverts and inverts, psychopathic types, just so long as any ignorant priest, justice of the peace, or other party is permitted to give permission to breed them." Now, while this might seem far afield from his writings on race, it was really just the other side of the same eugenic coin, another effort to protect the white race through controlled breeding. To Shufelt, Black people represented an external threat to whiteness, and queer people represented an internal one. The existence of Black queer people seems to have never entered his mind. These were discrete issues, but they were both, at heart, about promoting white supremacy. In the case of queer people, Shufelt further recognized that the biggest problem facing eugenicists in America was the public's lack of information. Until Americans understood that queer people existed, they couldn't be enlisted in the effort to prevent breeding more of them. Or as Shufelt wrote in an impassioned plea for more sexological research, quote, "How can we ever hope to improve the tissue of which our race is composed unless we are familiar with every cell now included in its composition?" Shufelt took a two-pronged approach to rectifying this ignorance. First, he studied queer people extensively, presenting them as pathetic human failures to be pitied, though, interestingly, not generally criminalized. He referred to one of his most frequent subjects as a, quote, "nervous, loquacious, foul-mouthed, and foul-minded fairy," among other contemptuous descriptions. Then, in order to popularize these findings, Shufelt fought against obscenity laws that prevented the printing, mailing, or sharing of publications that were deemed too erotic or sexual in nature. Writings by queer people were still suppressed, of course, but less so those about queer people, so long as they towed the line of the emerging medical and psychiatric consensus that human sexuality was composed of two opposite orientations, which were inborn, unwavering, and vastly unequal. Thus, in an effort to protect whiteness, Shufelt and his ilk cultivated a kind of medicalized homophobia, which simultaneously taught people that homosexuality existed and that they should despise it. They were so successful in this endeavor that by the time of the Stonewall riots, even though eugenics had long been discredited, their ideas had become the dominant way in which we understand human sexuality. Yet, in a bit of happy irony, Schufeld's fight for the freedom to discuss these sexual matters, which he believed would help us prevent queer children and thereby save the white race, fundamentally enabled LGBTQ people to discuss their experiences and organize with one another. Although we're still fighting discriminatory local, state, and federal policies which have deep roots in white supremacy, eugenicists like Shufeld were thus ultimately hoisted by their own homophobic petards. Thank you. Now I think we'll bring Robert back, and there he is.
There he is. There you are. That was such a wonderful article and so well read and so interesting, because what's fascinating to me, and just to start off, why hasn't this been uncovered before? Why hasn't this been discussed? And I could think of reasons, but I'd like to know what your take on it. When you wrote this, were you aware that this hadn't been addressed before? And I'll leave it at that for now.
You know, I was aware that people talked about eugenics in terms of the origins of sexuality, and I was aware that people talked about eugenics in terms of the origins of our modern ideas of race. The intersection of the two was rarely discussed because I think that it requires us this intersectional approach that you were talking about earlier. We have to look at how they were approaching queer people, not just in and of itself, the research that they were doing, but what motivated the research, right? Shufelt doesn't talk about race very much in his articles about perverts and inverts, but the entire reason that he's doing this research is his intense racist phobias about Black people in America, right? So once we look at that larger context, we can start to place the research on queer identities into this matrix of white supremacy. But until you have both of those contexts, you rarely see the two together. And I think for most people, lots of academics talk about this, right? There's a lot of scholars out there who've been doing this work, queer scholars, Black queer scholars. But in terms of that information getting out into a popular audience, I don't think we've seen that kind of discussion very often. In fact, when I was first publishing the book, people asked me, oh, are there any like really interesting things that you want to talk about and write articles about that people aren't talking about? And I brought this up repeatedly. And often I got told, actually, we were hoping more like, is there a closeted celebrity that nobody knows about that we could talk about? And I was like, yes, that's what everyone wants to talk about. No. But that's, I think, a lot of the reason why we don't talk about this issue is just that it requires melding these two different things that most people don't know a ton about and sort of examining them in context with one another. But when you're actually doing queer research, you see how this comes up over and over and over again. You see all of these weird things that only make sense if you understand this idea about eugenics, that the body is directly connected to the personality, and that if we can control one, we can control the other.
So this fascinates me, and I want to make this crystal to our audience and the folks watching and listening and engaged. You wrote When Brooklyn Was Queer literally years ago now. I mean, it was published last spring. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah.
So you
I
were doing.
started doing the research in 2010, actually.
So this is very of the moment, but you had no idea that this moment would come. I mean, none
No.
of us foresaw. You mentioned the Black Trans Lives Matter rally a couple of weeks back in Brooklyn, and there were tens of thousands in the streets. And it's one of those things where you and I both, I think, would never have imagined that a year earlier.
Yeah, I mean, the turnout is incredible, and I think that the excitement, the energy, not just for, pride as in a lovely, fun afternoon in the West Village, but pride as in an aggressive confrontation with homophobia, transphobia, racism, and the forces of American fascism. I think that's a very exciting pride that I did not see coming anytime soon.
But I mean, what I really want to get to and what I want our audience to realize is this is something that you brought to the forefront before it was a topic of conversation. And it's because, and this is why I first approached you over a year ago about the book and what I was so impressed with, other than, the writing being so crystal and really beautiful and engaging and funny at times and really heartbreaking at other times. But also the way you're able to see. I would have loved to sit with you at one of those library tables because I'm sure there are moments of epiphany for you, and I would have loved to just see your face light up when you're like
Well,
you made connections.
it's funny. There are definitely moments of epiphany. One that actually really directly relates to this. I knew always that race, racism, and white supremacy were going to have to be a large part of the conversation of my book. That's just the nature of queer history, particularly the period that I was looking at and the place that I was looking at. But one thing that I did not know, I didn't know a ton about the general history of Brooklyn. That was this area that I really needed to learn. And when I started doing the research for when Brooklyn was queer, I noticed that I was finding mostly white people. And now this happens when you're doing basic entry level research on anything, right? If you don't know how to look and you don't look closely, most of the sources you're going to find, if you're just looking at newspapers or mainstream texts and things like that, they're going to talk about white people. So I knew I was going to have to work around that no matter what. But this was at a level that I was shocked by. Why was it, I kept asking myself, that there seemed to be only white people in some of this history of Brooklyn? And so then I started to look at the actual history of Brooklyn and realized that for much of Brooklyn's history, it was a much more white space and a much more racist space than the rest of New York City. And in many ways, that's kind of hard to quantify. But we know that up until about the 1930s, Brooklyn was, well, from the end of slavery in New York up through the 1930s, Brooklyn was basically never less than 98% white. And at times it was as much as 99.5% white, much whiter than Manhattan. We also know that when there were votes taken around giving the right to vote to all Black men, not just Black men who owned property in the 1860s, the attempt to pass the bill fails in New York State. It only garners about 36% of the vote, I think. But in Brooklyn, it only gets 20% of the vote, right? Brooklyn was a white, racist, and parochial space in many ways, which also contained many people of color and actually had many people of color passing through it for work, for leisure, for friends, for religious reasons, for gatherings. There's an important Black neighborhood in Brooklyn's history named Weeksville that also has queer history to it that's incredibly important, right? Brooklyn has people of color as far back as we can go. In fact, before white people show up. But for a long period, the period in which modern LGBT identities were constructed and defined, the Victorian period up through the early 20th century, Brooklyn was a very white space. And so once I realized that, once I saw the demographics, once I saw the redlining, once I saw all of those elements, I knew that I was going to have to go in even more deeply than I had thought I was going to on white supremacy and racism. And it became a kind of thread that wends its way through the entire book. And this article was a great way for me to kind of pick it out and say, this epiphany was so important to me. I want to make sure that people don't miss it inside all of the other stories, because you can read my book and spend the entire time talking about how great and fun these, drag kings were, or all of the more exciting and upbeat elements, and maybe not get at this part of it.
So, first of all, so you wrote this piece for the Washington Post, and this was when too? I just want to clarify the timeline.
I think that was May of 2019.
So this is a year ago plus a couple of months. And again, it seems like they should really republish it. They should just reprint it, in full. We do have another comment, question from George. Reclaim pride. One thing, how do we deal with racism and/or transphobia in the queer community?
Mm-hmm.
Often from the weird log cabin types, but not exclusively. And then he says in paren, I saw your presentation at the Brooklyn Historical Society last November. It was a terrific evening.
Thank you. I think that's a great question. And I think it's one that has many, many answers, right? I think it's going to depend on each of us, who we are, who our community is, where and how we feel comfortable. I think the most important part of the question to me is the asking of it, each of us for ourselves, and laying out what it is we can do, where we can do it, how we can do it. I often think of when we're talking about isms and how do we respond to them, I think there's kind of two paradigms that we can use. There's the paradigm for people we are close to, where I think it's a calling in, right? That's a situation where you want to talk to someone and say, hey, this thing that you did, or this thing that you said, or this thing that you didn't do or say, really was troubling to me, and for these specific reasons, and can we talk? And I often find that this is best done, speaking individually, either in person or over the phone. This isn't something I would do over a social media post or anything like that. This is a conversation I have directly with someone who I can talk to directly. And I think that we address it specifically between us, and that way I can call someone in and bring them closer to my point of view. That's one side. The other side is the more calling out. This is a mass sort of effect. Instead of the one-on-one person I know very closely, I can talk to them about these issues and bring them closer to me. There's the mass effect of saying, I see this thing happening, I am going to call it out. I am not going to let it pass. Whether I'm in a meeting where someone says something that's really racist, or whether I'm, attending a Zoom like this and it doesn't get discussed, then I can bring it up. I think that those are the two kind of main paradigms for me about how we do this work. And it's important that we understand that both of those are valuable and valued, and they have different places in our world. I think inside the queer community, there are so many places and so many people who are at the very least open to these ideas because they have had some experience of marginalization themselves. And I hope that we can use that shared experience to go beyond our own ideas. I think of being queer as a vantage point, the possibility of seeing more, right? That you may not have if you were straight, and you don't necessarily learn more from it. You don't necessarily see more, but you can. So I know that that's not a very specific, how do we overcome racism in the queer community, but I just think that racism is part of everything, and overcoming it is almost impossible to talk about. Instead, it's a constant practice. I think being anti-racist exists in the specific actions and the moment to moment, because racism is the passive, forever, always answer. It is always there. If you are not resisting, you're kind of always implicated in the white supremacist system of America. So anti-racism always rests in the individual actions we take. We're always going to fuck it up. We always have to keep committing to it and keep trying to do it. And I should say, I have a bit of a neurological twitch that's really active today, so I apologize if I'm making weird faces on the left hand of my face. I just don't really control my eye over there very well.
We love you and your eye.
Thank you.
And yeah, I mean, that's why this moment is so imperative, that we don't let it pass, right? That June again was an extraordinary Pride, and I agree with you. It was my favorite Pride for years and years. And remember, last year we threw the first Pride parade in Princeton, and I never thought that we would top that experience. But this year was extraordinary because it was about the real essence of Stonewall. Last year might have been the 50th anniversary, but we're not buying the shirts this year. We were actually claiming the spirit of it, and we were incredibly honored to have Dr. Kendi on the show a couple of weeks ago to talk about his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and who would ever believe that would be the national bestseller. And like these moments, we can't let this just be, okay, we were really excited about this, now we're moving on to this.
Yep.
Right? And that's why these conversations need to be had. And that's why these articles that have been written, whether they were written in the past couple of months, which so many have, or they're written in May of 2019, we need to revisit them and revoice them and have them be heard in this new context. And this new context is about that we can really move forward now.
Yeah, we can. And, I think about the work of Richard Cloward and Francis Fox Piven, the sociologists, who looked at the gains that were made in the 1960s or who really said that the only thing that makes this possible is continued action in the streets. That is it. It has to be constant attention. It cannot be convenient. It cannot be quiet. It cannot be invisible. It has to be mass movements in the streets making trouble. As Bayard Rustin himself says, angelic troublemakers.
That's right. That's right. So I love this conversation, but I really would love to hear from the book, because I think that and maybe I'm just spoiled, but I love hearing you read from the book. I think that, well, there's one more thing that I wanted to talk about, because in the article you talk about how homophobia was not deep in American history, and it was something. Was it Schofield that brought this to not even the forefront? Was he the one that really, for lack of a better term, started the fire?
He's not. What's interesting is that there's a lot of oral histories that are done with folks who kind of live and are conscious as LGBTQ, as we would call them, adults in the 19-teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And they'll say things like, it's not until after World War II that you get the kind of vocal homophobia that we think of as today. The kind of like harassment in the streets, small, dark gay bars run by the mob and getting roughed up by the police. That had to develop over time. In the late 19th century, we don't have LGBT identity the way that we have them now. They were eugenicists, right? They thought you could read everything from your body. Homophobia largely is about being afraid of the hypothetical homosexual, right? You're trying to always say, I am not gay, and you can see that I'm not gay because I am doing these homophobic things. That wasn't necessary in the 19th century because there weren't invisible gay people who had this thing called sexuality. Instead, we were inverts, and an invert could be read in the body. If you looked at someone and it was a woman who was too mannish or a man who was too effeminate, you knew they were an invert. So you didn't have to proclaim yourself not an invert. Your not invertness was just by looking at you. So as doctors like Schofield and other sexologists tried to pick apart these things to try to define what did it mean to be a person who wanted to say a man who wanted to have sex with other men but did not want to dress like a woman, or a person who wanted to be identified as a man but did not want to have sex with other men. They were trying to pick apart all of these different things. And as they did that, they began to define this idea that sexuality existed. Sexuality was not just part of your gender. It wasn't determined by how you behaved. It existed in your brain in a certain way. And that is what makes homophobia this really scary force. But you have to have this idea of hidden homosexuality, not just visible bodily inversion, before homophobia can really develop the power that it has. And that takes first these scientists sort of inventing homosexuality, and that starts, the late 1800s in Europe and then moves into America. And then the mass mobilization of the Depression and World War II, which spreads the idea of homophobia around the country, or homosexuality around the country.
Right. So again, the book we're discussing is When Brooklyn Was Queer by Hugh Ryan. We strongly suggest you buy a copy for yourself, a copy for a friend, a copy for an enemy to become a friend. And as we were saying before, if you're just joining us, please do call your local library and make sure they have a copy on their shelves. And if they don't, you simply have to request it and they'll buy a copy for their shelves. And I promise you, as Hugh himself said, it will be incredibly meaningful for so many folks who are looking to find that possibility model, to find that venue, to find that opening, to find that window into who they may be. And books like this are imperative in that journey. So please do support our guest, not only for his sake. We love Hugh, but this is more about for you and for the community, and how important this book is, and really how wonderful it is. It is an extraordinary read, and we're going to have Hugh read from it in a moment. But I do want also, before we get to that, so we don't run out of time, because we always run out of time with you because we're having such a good time. Please tell us what you're working on now and how people can support that. I know you have a Patreon, and we want to make sure that people can be directed to that as well.
Yes, I have a Patreon. It's Hugh Ryan, patreon.com/Hugh Ryan. And my new project is actually, it came a little bit out of this book, but it's a very different look at queer New York City history. Small topic, but lots to express in it. What I'm looking at now is actually the Women's House of Detention, which was the prison that used to be in Greenwich Village. I don't think a lot of people realize that there were prisons in Greenwich Village basically from the late 1700s up until 1972. And one of them, the Women's House of Detention, which was there from 32 to 72, was really important in terms of the queer area, the queer reputation of Greenwich Village. And not only that, prisons in general are queer spaces, although we don't talk about them that way. I mean, today people estimate, the Williams Institute estimates that about 40% of women in jail identify as LGBT or same-sex oriented. 40%. And that's at a time when you couldn't be arrested for wearing the wrong kind of clothing, where you can't be arrested for sending the word lesbian through the mail, where you can't be arrested for sleeping with your girlfriend, all of which are actual cases that I have found among the women at the Women's House of Detention. The House of Detention connects these early people that I'm talking about, these kind of inverts that I was just reading about, Shufelt and those doctors, they study women. Well, Shufelt doesn't, but some of these doctors study women at the House of Detention. And it connects all the way up to Angela Davis and the women in leadership roles in the Black Panther Party who were kept there in the 1970s. In fact, Afeni Shakur was in the Women's House of Detention during the Stonewall riots. And the women and transmasculine people inside the House of Detention held a riot of their own on the first night of Stonewall, where they set fire to their possessions and threw them out the window while chanting, "Gay power, gay power, gay power." And yet we never talk about this, right? We never talk about the women's prison that made so much of the neighborhood of Greenwich Village queer. It was on Christopher Street, right? It's amazing to me that we've forgotten all of this, or not forgotten, but that we don't talk about it. And so that's going to be my next book. I'm writing it right now. And if you want to support it, please visit my Patreon, where I'm sharing some stories and some images as I go.
All right, great. So that's the Patreon /Hugh Ryan. Please do support our guest and support his wonderful work. And also, it's incredibly empowering, educational, and entertaining all at once. So it's basically everything we want the Power Hour to be in a Patreon. So please, if you would indulge me and indulge us in the community, if you would read. And I know that you said you wanted to read this piece, which is connected to everything we're talking about this person right here.
Yes, Loop the Loop. So when I read that article in the Washington Post, I quoted Shufelt referring to one of the people that he studied as a nervous, loquacious, foul-minded, and foul-mouthed fairy. And that is Loop the Loop. She is a fabulous figure, and I wanted to read this section for two reasons. One, in reading that piece about Shufelt, so much of the emphasis is placed on him, on the doctor, on his life. And I think that is another part of both white supremacy and straight supremacy, that we are always talking about the people who already are talked about the most. So I wanted to bring in to the other side of this discussion the women that we don't talk about, that he studied. And I also wanted to read this because I think that looking at Loop is an exercise in one of the most important parts of doing queer history, which is what a lot of folks refer to as reading against the archive, right? You're given a document that is created by someone like R.W. Shufelt that has a real agenda to it. And so you have to understand the context and read into it to understand what other possible interpretations of this evidence there might be. So without any further ado, I'm going to read from the criminal pervert section of my book. Loop the Loop was a young white trans woman from the slums of Brooklyn who was born on April 23rd, 1883. She was tall for her day, 5 feet 8 inches, and slender, with wavy dark brown hair that she often tucked under a blonde wig. Her eyes were blue, her teeth bright white, and when she was 14, in 1897, she'd had her ears pierced. She'd adopted her name from the popular Coney Island roller coaster, which had opened in 1901 and was one of the first to turn its riders completely upside down. She was an orphan, and she lived with a woman who acted as her guardian. Quick-witted, perceptive, and talkative, she had a meager education. Though she could read English, Loop couldn't write very well. How then do we know so much about Loop? On multiple instances, starting in 1906 and continuing at least until 1916, she was examined by Dr. Robert Wilson Shufelt, who had published his interactions with her in a 1917 journal article entitled The Biography of a Passive Pederast. As well as being a medical doctor, Shufelt was an Army lieutenant, prolific author, passenger pigeon enthusiast, photographer, grave robber, sexologist, blackmailer, and virulent racist, who believed that inversion and miscegenation were leading America to white racial suicide. He saw his work on sexuality as a means of saving humanity, and in particular, saving the white race from a slow, etiolated death by attrition. When Shufelt wasn't writing about passive pederasts such as Loop, he devoted his time to publishing books with titles like America's Greatest Problem, The Negro. However, these weren't two separate topics that caught his interest. Rather, they were both part of his belief in the science of eugenics. Early 20th century medical science was dominated by the eugenics movement, which believed social problems were rooted in deviant bodies and inheritable traits. The movement reached its apogee with the sadistic, anti-Semitic science of the Holocaust, which has allowed us to conveniently forget the power and prevalence of the eugenics movement in America. Just as people of color, women, and queer people were gaining social power and becoming visible, eugenic science would be trotted out to prove that Black people were less human, women were less intelligent, and queer people were a biological dead end that threatened to contaminate good, white Americans. The same doctors who would define the homosexual as a biological class unto itself would also define the pickpocket that way, and the woman who is erotically stimulated by hat pins as well. Today, it seems natural to view homosexuality this way, and ridiculous to think that being a pickpocket might be a hereditary, biologically defined class. But this is the biased, thoroughly unscientific swamp from which our modern ideas of sexuality arose. As a eugenicist, Schufelt's interest in Loop was twofold. One, Schufelt wanted to define what it meant to be a contrary-sexed male, primarily in terms of Loop's physiology, but also to some degree in terms of her lifestyle. Two, Schufelt wanted to show that Loop's degeneracy could be read from and was defined by her body. Sigmund Freud's system of psychoanalysis and his ideas about sexuality residing in the human mind only reached American shores in 1909. It would take long decades before they would supplant eugenic ideas about the body as our dominant way of understanding sexuality and personality in general. For this reason, Schufelt's article, although 10 pages long, barely contains any insights into what Loop thought or how she was raised. But it does meticulously diagram her body, including multiple nude photos. Loop's body, not her mind, was where her problems lay. A surprisingly large number of body parts could communicate unwholesome or downright psychopathic personality traits, according to Shufelt. Loop's facial features were coarse and of a criminal cast. Her thin, non-sensuous lips were inconclusive, but suggested that she was more of a decisive kind of person than a weak one. Overall, Shufelt judged that Loop's face lacked, quote, every expression indicative of truth, refinement, or good moral purpose. Although Loop informed the doctor that she had breasts, Shufelt said he could see no evidence of gynecomastia, the technical term for development of breasts in someone who is judged to be male at birth. This was a good thing for Loop, Shufelt believed, as gynecomastia, quote, is in evidence sometimes in criminals. Tellingly, although she could sing soprano, Loop could not whistle, a deficit that was, at the time, a commonly accepted indicator of inversion. Overall, Shufelt judged her to be, quote, a nervous, loquacious, foul-mouthed, and foul-minded fairy of the most degraded slums of a multi-million city. Loop made her living as a sex worker, and more specifically, as a streetwalker in Brooklyn. Digest this thought and all it implies for a moment. As early as 1906, in some areas of Brooklyn, a trans woman could be out on the street soliciting for sex with an active clientele. When Shufelt pressed her about how these men reacted to such things as her body hair, Loop simply shrugged and said, most of the boys don't mind it. That's just a little bit about Loop. There's more in here. She's a fantastic figure and truly, I think, an ancestor who does not get enough attention. I was so excited to get to research her life and to get to share it with folks through When Brooklyn Was Queer, and to see the ways in which she resists the same kind of imposition of white supremacy and homophobia that we today are trying to resist. When the doctor keeps studying her, she pushes back against him over and over again and tries to establish her right to her female identity. And that, I think, is what I get from looking at this history, right? It's a history of resistance. It's a history of fighting back. And it's a history of people who are so different in the lives they live from our world today that it allows me to imagine that our future could be incredibly different too. More than anything else, I don't look to our history for a mirror. I look to it for a window. I want to see things beyond me, because if something can be incredibly different 100 years ago, that means it can be incredibly different 100 years from now. And that, I think, more than anything else, is the message I would like folks to take away from this book, the potential for change.
So how does one, this is a question I've never asked you in our many conversations, both personally and professionally, how does one get to do what you do? Like when we find a story, when someone finds a story or a character or a movement, and we are so inclined, we want to tell this story. How do we do that? How does one engage in that?
I mean, I think the first thing to do is to make sure that you know the story, right? To go in deeply. I think these days there's a lot of encouragement to find something you think haven't been spoken about before or hasn't gotten enough attention and splash it on the internet without actually doing research and actually thinking about, how did that person identify? What other sources are there out about this person? Have I even correctly identified the person in the photo that I'm about to share? I think that we are rewarded most when we dig deep into this history, because it can on its surface look very familiar. And it's only as you dig in that you start to see the ways in which it's different, or the ways in which you might have made assumptions about what you're looking at. So I think that's the first thing, right? Dig in. Whatever it is that you're interested in, dig into it, whether that's by going and talking to people who are already alive or are alive now and who've lived through some of this history or who've studied some of this history, whether that's going to newspapers, whether that's going to video, whether that's looking at your own live journal, whatever it is, make sure that you know your subject closely, because once you know it, you will start to see the ways in which you can talk about it that are interesting, that people will want to hear about, that connect it to the modern moment we're in right now. But that takes a long time. And I think we never privilege that time, right? Even as a writer of history, I often find myself getting mad when I'm not sitting down and writing or sharing something, right? That I don't put enough emphasis into really researching and understanding my research. But that's where all of this lives, right? The things that we learn only come because we know them well, not because we write them and then share them. That's the last step. So I think the writing is the last part that we get to. First, we try to do as much research as we can, learn as much as we can about our subject, learn why we're passionate about it, learn why other people might be passionate about it. And then, for me at least, it was a really slow, I didn't start off as a writer. I actually was originally working with homeless LGBT youth here in New York City. That was my first job here in New York. And writing was something I did on the side. It was a little bit. I would write for newspapers that would hire me when there were little local newspapers, and I would write for websites, and I would write for no money, and I wrote terrible book reviews, and I wrote travel articles, just anything to start to build up my cred as a writer. And at the same time, I was learning my material, so that when I finally did have my material, I had venues where they would publish me, and I kind of just worked my way up through that.
So what is it about? We also have to remember not to take for granted that people know these stories. When you hear something, it's really important that, of course, you research it and you make sure that the facts are right and everything is being identified in the right way and the people are being identified. Because so frequently now we find there's so much erroneous reporting and social media tools of the devil have great benefits, but obviously there's a lot of misinformation spread throughout. But once you do verify what you've learned or what you've been excited about, what you have found out is in actuality the story that you think it is, amplify it, right? Find a way, because there's so much of our history, and I'm talking about across the spectrum of race, ethnicity, gender, or lack thereof, sexuality, religion or lack thereof, and so on, and differently abled folks, everybody, right? There's so many stories that are still untold, still unheard, still unrecognized, and don't ever take for granted that people know these stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say, if you are interested in this kind of work, if you are interested in writing history and sharing history, I think one of the best things you can do is read other people's work and share it and promote it and understand what they are doing and the stories they are telling and the perspectives they bring to this. I think for every one thing I write, I probably read 1,000. That was actually the motto of my grad program, the Bennington Writing Seminars, was read 100 books, write one. And I think that's very true. I think that if you want to be engaged in the world of writing and the world of queer history, read other people, share their work, promote the voices that aren't just your voice.
Yeah, and that's such an important part of it too. And thank you for saying that. You know, it's about not just amplifying your own voice or your own community. It's finding that way, and now we're gonna go all the way back to the beginning of our conversation. Find that intersectionality. How is it all connected, right? We have this wonderful term that Kimberly Crenshaw, coined back in the late '80s, and it's not just a term. It's now a way of life. Again, we hearken back to that Black Trans Lives Matter rally that was organized by many folks. But one of them, Raquel Willis, who was on the show a while back, and is an incredible hero of so many different communities, right? And that's why I think you and I agree that this moment is different than all other moments, because we're seeing all these communities come together. They wouldn't have imagined before, and we're seeing tens of thousands of folks from all across different communities come out for a Black Trans Lives Matter movement rally. So that's my last question to you, is really concretely, how do we create out of this moment a movement? How do we keep it going? And you said being in the streets, you touched on it, but how do we really, in these last few minutes, how can we, and it's only a few minute question.
Yeah,
so
nice easy one. Thank you for a softball question at the end here. I mean, I think it's everything. It's about being in the streets, but it's also about what are you doing in your workplace? What books are you reading? What books are you reading to your kids? What school are you going to? I think that so many areas of our life where we can be making decisions consciously in a way that supports social justice. And obviously we're never going to be able to make every single decision, and we're never going to make all the right ones, but I think it's about having that framework, that matrix in your head that says, hey, could this be done in a way that was less racist? Could this be done in a way that was less misogynist? Could I promote voices that are not being promoted in this field right now? When I look at this thing, whether it's a party that I've walked into or an anthology that I'm thinking about buying, who's there and who's not there? That's, I think, what we've got to be asking ourselves. And then, of course, connecting with those people who are around us, whether those are people that we know, people we don't know, going to their movements, showing up for the people we want to show up for us, taking care of the people we want to take care of us, not constantly centering our own thing, I think really matters. But God, there are so many answers to that. I think the work that you're doing through this, and the work that everyone that's coming through this, the center, is part of that. Having spaces that allow us to continue organizing even when we're not in person anymore, that really matters. And of course, supporting those spaces that we hope will be around on the other side of this pandemic to allow us to organize in person, whether that's your favorite queer bar, or whether that's the local university or the local library.
Right. So thank you so much, my friend. Again, one last time, pushing the book. It's important. It's a wonderful book, and I wouldn't do it if I didn't believe in it, and if I didn't really enjoy it. When Brooklyn Was Queer by Hugh Ryan. In the comments section, there is a bookshop.org link. It's very simple, and again, it supports independent bookstores and the authors themselves. So it's a really great way, instead of a big box store or one of those huge monolithic online spaces. So thank you again, my friend. I want to put you on the spot and invite you back. I think that no matter what the school year looks like in September, college and elementary through secondary school, obviously our students and our families are going to be working through some difficult choices, some difficult moments. I think it'd be great if you were so interested and inclined and had the time to come back, and we could have a little seminar for students going back to school and to give them something to inspire them for
Absolutely.
whatever.
I would love it.
All right, good. Good.
Anytime.
Thank you, my friend. And you let us know anything we can do for you. It's always wonderful to see you. Really appreciate your time and your energy and your spirit. Be well.
It's wonderful. Take care, everyone. Thank you for joining what I'm sure is your 8 millionth Zoom of the day. So I hope everyone gets to rest and be off their screens after this.
All right.
Take care.
So that's Hugh Ryan, author of When Brooklyn Was Queer. Wonderful book, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. And if I'm overdoing it, it's only because the excitement of what a wonderful book it is. It's incredible subject matter, but it's also written in such a beautiful, poetic way as well. So please do, if so inclined, support Hugh and the book. And speaking of support, look at the support of this. That's some good support right there. Tomorrow night, join us for the Mike Hotpence Variety Hour. It's the first of the sort we're doing here at the center after 100 and some odd episodes, and many of them have been very odd. We're having a variety hour a la the ones from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Carol Burnett, Ed Sullivan, going all the way back, Johnny Carson, all those shows. We're going to have a full-on experience courtesy of our good friend Mike Hotpence. And he has scored a tremendous guest for the show. He is going to have with him Jill Sobel, who most of you will remember from the great song I Kissed a Girl. And I said at the top of the hour, do not think of her as a one-hit wonder. As she says herself, she's a two-hit wonder. So come out, enjoy some good music, enjoy the comedy stylings of Chris Murphy, who will join us. We're going to have some pseudo Jeopardy questions. If you follow Mike Hotpence on social media, every Friday he does some Jeopardy for us, and we'll do that in the show live. So we're looking forward to an incredible show tomorrow night. So join us tomorrow night and every night for the Power Hour. We look forward to always having you with us. As our good friend Haley, who presents the open and out mic night that we have on some Friday nights. We supply the hour, but you supply the power. Our beloved community, we so appreciate you being with us. Well, we love and respect you all, and have a great evening. Have a great day. We'll see you back here in 22 hours and 55 minutes. Until then, we'll leave you with a taste of Mike Hotpence to get you prepared for tomorrow night. Be well, my friends. Be loved.
Hey there, Mike Hotpence here. When I am not busy shaking my can for worthy charities, I am tuned in to the fabulously empowering Bayard Rustin Center for Social Justice Power Hour, coming at you every weeknight at 7 p.m. live from the BRCSJ Virtual HQ over on their Facebook page. Head over there, follow them, like them, and join us for Power Hour. We want you. In the meantime, stay safe, stay strong, keep washing those hands, and keep shaking those cans.